Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. For those in-house, we would ask that initial courtesy check that our mobile devices have been silenced or turned off. We welcome, of course, those who are watching us on the heritage.org website and remind them that they're welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. And of course, in the question and answer session following, we will be passing mics throughout the audience, again, for the recording of this event. Leading our discussion and opening our program today is Timothy Dutcher. Timothy is my colleague in the Coalition Relations Department, where he serves as an Associate Director. Please join in welcoming him. Tim?
All right, thanks everybody. I'm going to be very brief here, but I just kind of want to set the stage a little bit before I bring Steve up. As conservatives, we know that lowering taxes is virtuous, and it helps to lead economic growth and opportunity for everyone. We believe that. Many on the left look for opportunities to prove that tax cuts don't work as we intend them to work. And their most recent case, the Kansas tax cuts implemented under Governor Brownback in 2012. Fast forward 5 years to 2017, and the tax cuts have disappeared. And a wave of bipartisan lawmakers implemented the largest tax hike in Kansas history. This sparked many on the left to use Kansas as a warning shot against tax reform in general, even using it to try and instruct federal policy. The New York Times wrote, quote, "Kansas tried a tax plan similar to Trump's, it failed." And then Slate, "Kansas's notorious experiment with radical business tax cuts is a historical example to be avoided at all costs." An attempt to move things along, I just want to get the introductions out of the way, so I'm gonna give those right now. Part of our panel, Grover Norquist. That's you, right? Perfect. He's the president of Americans for Tax Reform. That's a taxpayer advocacy group that he founded in 1985 at President Reagan's request. ATR works to limit the size and costs of government and opposes high taxes at federal, state, and local levels. ATR organizes the Taxpayer Protection Pledge, say that 10 times fast, and I'll give you $1, which asks all candidates for federal and state office to commit themselves in writing to the American people to oppose all net tax increases. In the 115th Congress, 212 House members and 45 senators have taken the pledge. Jonathan Williams, chief economist and vice president for the Center for State Fiscal Reform at the American Legislative Exchange Council. He works with state policymakers, congressional leaders, and members of the private sector to develop fiscal policy solutions for states. Williams is also the co-author of Rich States, Poor States, along with Dr. Laffer and our pal, Steve Moore here. Williams has appeared in many publications, including Wall Street Journal, Forbes, Investors Business Daily. Moderating our panel discussion a little later, Joel Griffith is the director of the Tax and Fiscal Policy Task Force at ALEC. He's a lawyer, a writer, and has spent countless hours researching the Kansas tax issue, as well as many other state and federal tax issues. He's also a friend of mine, too. And gentlemen, thank you so much for being here. Appreciate it. And now, brief introduction for Steve Moore. He's a distinguished visiting fellow here at the Heritage Foundation and a former member of the Wall Street Journal editorial board. During the 2016 presidential campaign, he served as a senior advisor to President Trump on economic issues. You can see Steve daily as a senior economic analyst on CNN. You can read him weekly as a columnist for the Washington Times and his soon-to-be-released book, Trumponomics. Among many other things, he's my former boss and an all-around good guy, Steve Moore.
Okay, so I've been waiting eagerly for this session because it was about 6 or 7 years ago that we got a call, Art Laffer and I, from Sam Brownback about redesigning the Kansas tax system. And so we worked very closely with them to put together a plan that was mostly very positive. We cut the income tax rates. Dave Trabert will talk about this, but we cut the tax rates for individuals. We one of the controversial features was we eliminated the tax on small business income. And that became very controversial because some businesses and some individuals used it a way to game the system and lower their tax rate. But it became almost overnight, after a couple of years, certainly, it became a cause célèbre for the left that somehow everything had gone wrong in Kansas. And I think we're here today to dispel some of those rumors. I'm not going to go through, I'll let Dave talk about what really happened in Kansas, but I will say this, that this idea that this was some kind of a massive failure is simply a mythology. And I was just digging up some of these statistics on what happened in Kansas, and I just thought I'd read some of them to you just to set the record straight. So by 2016, which was about 4 years after the tax cut was implemented, the Kansas unemployment rate hit 3.9%, the 10th lowest in the country. Kansas's private sector employment was growing faster since the tax cuts took effect than all of its neighboring states, save for Colorado. Income tax rates for individuals, families, and small businesses were reduced by 30% until they raised taxes. Kansas's pension funding was ranked 22nd best in the nation 3 years after the tax cut. That was a vast improvement from the state's second worst in the nation ranking back when Governor Brownback took office. The pension system's funding ratio grew to 63%, which was a big improvement over what it had been. So there were a lot of successes in Kansas. The problem was that the revenues didn't come in as anticipated, and Dave will address that issue. But I will simply end my short comments by saying this, that I wrote a piece in the Weekly Standard about the tax increase that Tim mentioned that happened. When was that? Last year? Dave, when was it?
Well, which one?
The big one.
The big one, the last big one was 17.
2017, right? So I had a piece in the Weekly Standard on why that was a mistake, and I loved the title they put on it, which was called "If They Only Had a Brain," and so that was a major mistake. And we have a new. One of the things I work with Jonathan on at ALEC is a ranking of the states based on their fiscal policies, regulatory policies. It's taken very seriously by lawmakers, and I guess, Jonathan, as a result of that tax increase, Kansas, we don't want to, we'll give people maybe a little sneak preview. It looks like they've probably fallen as a result of that. So that's the lay of the land, and there's nobody better to talk about what really happened in Kansas than my good friend Dave Trabert. He is the president of the Kansas Policy Institute. He's a frequent speaker to business, legislative, and civic groups, and also does research and writes on fiscal policy and education issues. Trabert regularly testifies before Kansas House and Senate committees on state budget, tax, and education issues. Dave was on the front lines fighting against raising taxes last year and provided a true north to lawmakers leading up to the decision to raise taxes. In his book just released, What Was Really the Matter with Kansas' Tax Plan, he corrects the record that has been so skewed by the left and provides a path forward to lower taxes. Please join me in giving a nice round of applause to Dave Trabert.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks for that very generous introduction, and thanks to the entire Heritage team, and especially Tim Descher, for pulling this event together and hosting it here. Thanks to Grover Norquist and the team at Americans for Tax Reform, and my friends Joel Griffith and Jonathan Williams at ALEC, who've all been very loyal and faithful champions of telling the truth about what happened in Kansas. Forgot to bring my little clicker with me. You know, we started a few years ago looking at what was really going on in Kansas and trying to tell that story. There were, for years, people who were opposed to tax cuts were using Kansas as their proof that you couldn't successfully cut taxes. But at the same time, we were seeing states like North Carolina and Indiana and Tennessee successfully cut taxes. So the real issue is what was different about the Kansas experience. Now, some of the things that were said about Kansas weren't accurate, but Kansas really did have some very serious budget challenges, and a lot of that was avoidable. There were some mistakes made. There were some other circumstances at play, including a very toxic political environment throughout that 5-year span. So we decided last year that we needed to tell this important story so that policymakers like you, legislators and citizens across the country could benefit from the lessons learned in Kansas and try to help your efforts to reduce taxes going forward. One of the things that we found was there were some very big avoidable mistakes made in Kansas. Number one, don't cut taxes and increase spending. That's a pretty simple math problem. Number two, actually have a plan to balance the budget. And number three, have the right systems in place. Now, the narrative on spending in Kansas was that state spending had been devastated. It was horrible, terrible, you pick the adjective. None of that was true. The year that they signed the plan into place in 2012, they also approved a $400 million spending increase. And then, from that point, they increased spending several more times, each time setting new spending records, all the while they were trying to figure out how to deal with a large tax cut. Now, the rate of growth declined, and so to a lot of people in government, that's a cut. But in reality, total spending increased. And how do you do that? Well, we had a lot of people come to us at the beginning saying, look, we love this idea. We really need to reduce taxes in Kansas, but how are we going to run government on that much less revenue? It was the initial, at this point, they were talking several $100 million. So we went out and looked at the spending patterns of all 50 states, and it was simply a matter of the spending. What we found was that the states that tax income spend 42% more per resident than the states without an income tax. We used NASBO data, pulled out all the federal spending, pulled out anything related to debt, and we're left with the states that tax income spending 42% more. Now, every state provides the same basic basket of services. They have education and highway programs and social services. But the states that can provide those services at better prices are able to pass the savings on to residents in the form of lower taxes. As I said, there was no plan to balance the budget. And even this skinny plan at the beginning, Governor Brownback's initial proposal was only $350 million tax cut over 5 years. By the time that left the House of Representatives, it was up to $1 billion cut. And then the Senate moved it up to $3.5 billion over 5 years. And they were counting on, this was an election year in 2012, they were counting on the governor not signing that. It's not what he wanted. He went back for over a week imploring them to come back and negotiate something else. They wouldn't do it, so he signed it. But throughout that period, they never had a plan to actually balance the budget. If this passes, how will we balance the budget going forward? Because they knew by the time it got to where he was signing it, they knew it was in serious trouble 2 years in. There was a giant hole because the reserves would be gone. Having the right systems in place would have helped. I mean, legislators don't like to cut spending. As one legislator, one Republican asked or responded in kind of a fit of frustration when he was asked, why don't you guys just cut waste out of government and balance the budget that way? He said, well, we'd all lose our jobs if we did that. And that's really what was driving a lot of these things. But there wasn't a system in place that would easily identify opportunities to cut spending. Kansas didn't have a performance-based, or in some people call it a priority-based budget system. That's a process whereby every program and service offered by every agency is analyzed for effectiveness, for efficiency, and need, and then ranked in priorities so that these opportunities to reduce costs can kind of bubble to the surface. It makes it easier for legislators to find them. We didn't have that. We also didn't have a really reliable revenue estimating system. There was a study done a couple of years ago where the new revenue secretary advanced quite a long list of ways that we could improve it and make it more effective. Something simple like waiting until the April tax receipts are actually in before estimating what they might be. The legislature wouldn't change that. Having those right systems in place would have made a big difference for Kansas. We also exposed a few myths. The first one is that giant tax plan from 2012 was never really implemented. The first thing Governor Brownback did when he came back in 2013 was propose shaving back on some of the deductions, mortgage interest and medical deductions and so forth. So that took back part of the plan. And then once the reserves were gone and they hadn't been able to reduce spending, when they had a giant sales tax increase in 2015, between those two main elements, just a little bit more than half of the original plan was actually implemented. It was still a big cut, but it wasn't anywhere as near as large as what it was intended to be. The other big myth is that there really wasn't much tax avoidance. As Steve mentioned, there was this plan to exempt income, small business income. It was called pass-through businesses. These are businesses where like proprietorships and partnerships, where the income flows through. It's passed through to the individual owners and reported on their individual income tax returns. So when Kansas first estimated what this would be worth, they said there's about 190,000 entities that would claim the exemption. When it came out, the first year, there were actually 330,000 claiming it. So that led to rampant speculation that a lot of companies changed their tax status. Turns out the IRS data all along said there were about 330,000 pass-through entities in Kansas. When they made their 190,000 estimate, they weren't counting, because it's on 3 schedules, like Schedule C, E, and F. They were only counting one of the 3 federal schedules. Why they didn't own up to that is a mystery. When they discovered it, we don't know, but that led to that rampant speculation. The Department of Revenue tracks C corporations converting to small business pass-through status, and there was a tiny uptick in the number of them converting, but not much more than it was prior to tax reform. And then finally, there was an independent academic study that attributed only 2% of the revenue decline to tax avoidance. Now let's talk about that toxic political environment. People tend to think of Kansas as a very conservative state. But when Governor Brownback was elected in 2010, media was speculating that it might have been 50 years since Kansas actually had a conservative governor. And from that day forward, the attempts were put in place to make sure that never happened again. And one of the ways that manifested itself was when this plan was passed, knowing that there was a giant budget hole coming, Democrats and many Republicans refused to propose or support any kind of a plan to structurally balance the budget, either with tax increases or spending adjustments. What developed was kind of a burn it down mentality, where a lot of people would rather see the entire tax plan and Governor Brownback go down in flames than actually try to fix it. In fact, that controversial pass-through exemption could have been eliminated in 2016. It was voted on in the House of Representatives. It failed by 19 votes, with 24 Democrats and moderate Republicans voting against it. And these are people who for years had been saying it's unfair, we need to get rid of it, that they were blaming the big budget problems on it. But when it came time to get rid of it, they wouldn't vote for it, because 2016 was an election year. And they admitted that if they got rid of it in May, voters might not think they had to get rid of conservative legislators. So they let it stay in place, and then they got their wish. We did get a much more moderate legislature in the 2016 elections. There were also a few other things going on in Kansas that were completely unrelated to tax issues. Kansas is an oil state. It's not Oklahoma, Texas type of an oil state, but oil is a much bigger segment of the Kansas economy than most states. And we're all benefiting still at the pump from the lower oil prices. Well, 2014, when those prices started coming down, that really hit severance receipts hard in Kansas. Kansas is also an ag state. So at about the same time, we saw serious declines in farm commodity prices. And so that double whammy of oil prices and farm commodities coming down really depressed sales tax receipts in those parts of the state, as well as the severance tax. So what are the lessons learned? Well, first of all, don't cut taxes and increase spending. You don't even have to be good at Common Core math to understand that's not going to work out. Actually have a plan in place up front to balance the budget, and ideally build it around making government more efficient. Kansas didn't have to become as efficient as the other states. We basically had to go from being morbidly inefficient to grossly inefficient. Just a little bit more would have done it. Have the right systems in place. And finally, be honest with citizens. Governor Brownback made one of those infamous mistakes in saying this would be a shot of adrenaline to the economy. Well, these things take time. They're certainly going to be beneficial. We saw benefits, but you can't raise expectations beyond reality because the opposition will ride that all the way to the next election. So thanks, thanks again for this. Let's open this up for some questions now if you want to, Joel.
Well, good afternoon, and thanks everyone for being here. I wanted to open up a question with to Jonathan Williams with American Legislative Exchange Council. You've been on the ground, I believe, actually in every state now over the last 10 years. What was your experience like on the ground, working both with ALEC legislative members and also with partners such as Dave at KPI?
Well, thank you, and thanks for having me here today. It's just been a pleasure to work with Dave over these years. He's been a great partner at the State Policy Network Group, Kansas Policy Institute, trying to enact better public policy and just work with legislators to do the right thing in a very difficult situation, of course, as he's aptly described. And traveling the 50 states, working with 2,000 legislators that we have at ALEC over these last dozen years or so, I have never seen a situation where the reality is so misaligned with what's being reported, as what happened in the Kansas situation. We saw so many different groups come out there with half-truths, and some were trying to intentionally mislead the public to the facts on the ground. And so to answer your question, working with so many good members out there and probably spending a lot of nights out there in Topeka, Dave, that's for sure. Probably a couple dozen trips over this experiment. A couple of the big lessons were, as Dave obviously put it, and I think Art Laffer, Steve and my co-author, Rich States, Poor States, probably says it best. It's not rocket surgery when it comes to good economics, right? Like this, you cannot have big spending increases and a total disregard for looking at spending growth, coupled with what otherwise would have been a very good pro-growth tax plan. And it just does get to the issue, I think, where there were so many good legislators that then became outnumbered. And, a lot of people from the outside don't realize that Kansas really, for a long time, has had three political parties. It's had the conservative Republicans, the Democrats, and the liberal Republicans. And unfortunately, given the sense of several election cycles, is that conservative Republicans were not in the majority and haven't been for quite some time in Kansas. That's why they did some very silly things like turn their back on the tax cuts and have state record tax increases in both 2015 and 2017 on income, and then go after some very good innovative technologies like vaping, for instance, and have one of the first vape taxes in the country, which it was so poorly put together that the implementation has been pushed back now for how many years? So some very horrible ideas came, but I think the perceptions of what happened so far different than reality on the ground. And having had the pleasure, I guess, of being out there so many times and having to try to tell the truth alongside of Dave and our allies here on this panel today, it's just been kind of frustrating to see. And I do think, though, it's a teachable moment for other states, and it's a teachable moment for future Kansas legislators, in that no policy failure like this has turned out to be because of the tax increases is permanent. And there's opportunities for us to turn this around, not only in Kansas, but learn some very important lessons in other states across the country.
I had a question for you, Grover. I know you and other folks such as both Jonathan and Steve Moore provided a lot of input for those that were designing the initial Kansas tax package. Can you give your analysis of some of the ways in which that could have been approved, and also what message would you like to give to both legislators in Kansas and also in several other red states that are looking to increase taxes this session?
Sure. I didn't really have any input on the takeoff. I was there during the several landings as they were trying to figure out what to do. Pardon? Oh, yes, sorry, there we go. I was declining the honor of being one of the authors of this, but a couple of points. One, I think that the left's focus on Kansas has been very unhelpful to Kansas and very unhelpful to tax reform. But what it also shows you, if you step back from it, is how weak their hand is, okay? They don't say Kansas and all those guys in Texas and Florida and Tennessee and Nevada with no income taxes is all falling apart. They stay on Kansas and then, as you point out, have to make a series of omissions about the collapse of $100 million a year in oil revenues because the oil price went down, which was not Kansas specific and was not caused by the Kansas tax bill, and affected Texas and Oklahoma and Alaska and Saudi Arabia, which Brownback wasn't responsible for. We don't think. So whereas when we talk about challenges with state governance, we'll talk about Illinois and California and Connecticut, and we have a whole list of things that you can talk about. And those wonderful, I'm going to sell some books here, that wonderful collection of inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of states, like Wealth of Nations, but Wealth of States. And Steve Moore is one of the authors with Laffer and Travis Brown and Norquist. This goes through a very good collection of those states that put in income taxes and how everything got worse when they put the income taxes in. Everything they said would happen didn't happen. But it's not one, they don't pick Rhode Island and go, oh, well, Rhode Island, we extrapolate from Rhode Island that tax cuts will never work in Hong Kong. What it is they go through, here are the 18 or 11? Anyway, 11 states, thank you. The 11 states that have created income taxes in recent history, so you know what was going on and what they do. And the other one is How Money Walks. And there's a website that I would send you to, buy the book too, but, and Travis Brown put this together. People move into states with no income tax or low income taxes, and they leave the high tax states. They leave the high spending states and go to low spending states. You can cut it any way you want to. And people have been leaving Kansas for quite some time because Kansas had high taxes. Kansas had pre-Reagan Republican majorities in the House and Senate. And like those woolly mammoths that fall into the ice and get frozen or whatever, we can talk about Rockefeller Republicans and people's eyes glow. What's a Rockefeller Republican? Because there's a long time ago in New York, we had Republicans that would raise taxes and go completely crazy on spending, and all these other left of Senate and do what the labor unions and trial lawyers wanted, and they're called Rockefeller Republicans. Well, they all mostly died out in New York. But frozen in ice is the Republican Party, much of the Republican Party in the state legislature in Kansas. I mean, Bob Dole, who had complete contempt for the idea of reducing marginal tax rates. And that translated there. There's that wonderful scene when the Republican wanted to cut taxes, the governor wanted to cut taxes, and the moderates didn't want to cut taxes, so they took the lower rates, took all the pay-fors out, and then passed that. And then they sat back and said, ha, 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 now he can't primary us, saying that we're not for tax cuts. And because nobody would be crazy enough to pass this. Well, they looked at it, and the other house said, we'll pass it. And then there were competing efforts to slow down. These other guys wanted to unpass the bill they'd passed, and they were trying to quickly pass it. And it did pass with larger rate reductions and not as much, and not the base broadening that the governor had originally wanted. And you could have then, quote unquote, fixed it or whatever, and, or done spending restraint, which, as you point out, they didn't do. So I think there are a bunch of lessons that come from this, but one of them is, and I passed out this wonderful colored chart, all reds are not the same. You know, when you buy paint or Crayola crayons, they have lots of different shades of red. Okay, legislatures come in different shades of red, and Kansas is still, unfortunately, pre-Reagan Republican red. The other challenge you have is all these lovely southern states, which are really red painted over blue. You have all these guys who all their lives were Democrats stealing money and bringing it back to the capital, to the county courthouse, and then they repainted themselves red because they had to get elected, and they said, okay, let's see, I go to church from time to time and I have a gun. Okay, I'm a Republican. And they didn't realize that we've added a few things to the list of things that you have to be for to be a Republican. So we have a number of states where red, as fun as this map is, isn't real red. Now, Florida, Texas, a number of states, deep red, Reagan red, but not Kansas And that's what the other team, they didn't want to say liberal republicanism has failed. They wanted to say Reagan republicanism has failed. That's the one thing that wasn't on trial.
Thank you. Dave, you mentioned some of the myths that are still being propagated in the media and also by numerous politicians about the amount of pass-throughs, those that are claiming to be pass-throughs and they really aren't, and how that was really a minuscule part of the revenue shortfalls that have been claimed. Could you go into a bit of detail, and also to our other two panelists, if you prefer, can you go into a bit of detail the importance of the pass-through exemption and why that type of a tax cut may be more important than other types?
You know, most people don't understand that while they're small businesses, partnerships, LLCs, proprietorships, we heard all the talk about how C Corps were taxed marginal rate of 35%. Well, the pass-through business's marginal rate was 39.6% because that's all taxed at the individual level. So when you have, and now that you have rates come down, corporate rates, when you're looking in Kansas, for example, you have a corporate tax rate of 7% maximum. We have a disparity. If you have disparities between those rates, you are encouraging some tax gaming. Some people will try to make some switches. But the really importance of this, one of the things we point out in the book is that entrepreneurs are, at least, the pass-through companies, most of them are pretty entrepreneurial. We looked at IRS or census data on job creation, and what we found was remarkable. Well, actually, I'll take that back. We didn't find it. Dr. Art Hall at the University of Kansas found it. If not for jobs created by new establishments, and that could be a C Corp or it could be someone starting a new restaurant, but if not for jobs created by new establishments, this country wouldn't have had any private sector job growth since 1977. The net losses from all other types of jobs exceed the gains from new establishments being created. So encouraging, that's one of the main roles of government, is get out of the way. We need taxes, we need some regulation, but when you're discouraging startups, and that's what a lot of small businesses are, Kansas was one of the places we were lucky. We actually would have had 2 years of private sector job growth. Nationwide, nothing. So it's critically important that we understand that taxes are a huge deterrent to startup. It takes capital out. Some of the testimony we heard when we were trying to preserve this, small business people coming in saying, yeah, there were a few who said, yes, I was able to expand my business. A few others said, you know what? Every penny I saved on state income tax, I was spending in new Obamacare taxes. Others said, well, I was able to use that to catch up on years of deferred maintenance. So no, I didn't expand my business, but it made a big difference to my business. So it was huge, Joel. It really was.
A question to all three of you. During your presentation, Dave, you talked about how the difference in the tax proposals from the governor, the House, and the Senate, the wide disparity in the so-called cost of those plans. And something that Grover mentioned was the fact that there wasn't enough base broadening in this tax package. To the three of you, could you give some examples of ways in which the plan did not broaden the base and the importance of that when looking at tax reform?
I got one. When they're trying to decide how to fit, we have this hole in the budget because we're not raising enough money. Actually, we're spending too much money, not they're overspending. There was $80 million that you could raise if you legalized the sale of beer, wine, spirits on Sunday, because Kansas is surrounded by other states with rational blue laws. And they didn't want to do, one or two people didn't want to do this, and so we couldn't get this across the finish line. That would have raised, that's not raising taxes, legalizing an activity that was perfectly legal on Saturday, on Sunday, and allowing people to keep their stores open, or at least the beer, wine, and spirits part of their stores open on a Sunday, would have solved a good chunk at one point of what they needed to do to get out the finish line. And you just had people who said, no, I'm against liquor, everybody has to be made to go to church or something, and they voted down. So, I mean, that is a base broadening that's not a tax increase. It increases revenue without raising taxes. And the guys in the legislature were playing such not team sport. They weren't working together, and they were off on their own little zones. And that was a good piece of 1 year's problem, and they didn't do it.
You know, it was interesting, the discussion about the pass-through exemption centered on fairness. And there were some very legitimate fairness issues. You have some business owners weren't having to pay income tax, but their employees were. And yet, when that was raised in the legislative hearings, we were saying, look, there are some legitimate issues. Let's put all the fairness issues on the table. Because the first group of tax-exempt people in Kansas was not small business. It's government retirees. Their pension income is not subject to tax. They pay a little bit on what they contribute, but when they pull their pension out, they never pay tax on the government piece, on the employer contribution, or any of the earnings. Universities are completely exempt from their plans. There's all kinds of sales. Every year, there is one after another organization or local entity that wants another sales tax exemption. So let's put all of these exemptions on the table at one time. Let's look at them. And of course, that wasn't really what it was about. It was about politics. There were lots of opportunities to broaden the base. There just wasn't the political will to do that.
No, and the other thing, I think Dave's point is great on the sales tax side. This is similar in many states in that so many states actually have more exemptions on the sales tax, out of the sales tax base than they collect in sales tax revenue, which I think is still the case in Kansas. And every year, a new group comes together and asks for kind of a special interest type bill on special exemptions. So that's an easy one to take a look at, and some big dollar amounts there, which could perhaps have led to elimination of the income tax if they could have just gone after the sales tax broadening side. But to piggyback on the small business piece of it also, because I think that's such an important point, is yes, that was a couple of $100 million that they weren't going to raise. However, it is the tip of the spear in terms of economic growth as well. I mean, we know that small business is the engine of the economy in terms of new job creation and new economic opportunity. And, you know, dealing with the legislators all those years back as they were thinking about how to put this together was they realized the rationale for this, the reason that they put together the tax reform plan was to rescue Kansas from decades of underperformance when it comes to job creation and economic growth. Of course, that got watered down with the threats and then ultimate occurrences of the tax increases, but focusing on that portion of it, which would create the biggest bang for the buck in terms of revenue spent on taxes, or in this case, not collected, this was, I think, exactly the right thing. We can look at it from an armchair quarterback all day long, whether we would have done that, hindsight being 20/20. Of course, you know, that's a much different characterization to have at that point. However, that being said, this is also important that it was not just going to be the small business portion at zero. The idea was to get everybody on the individual side to zero by the March to Zero plan, which was use revenue triggers and future economic growth to completely eliminate the personal income tax. They just started with the small business side, and of course they lost the spending discipline, which then made the complete elimination of the personal income tax unfeasible at that point.
What you just touched on there, I think was the most important part of the whole fight. It's one thing for them to go, ah, ha, ha, Kansas. It's really not much of an argument in other states that are either failing, like Illinois. No, don't mind tax increases. Kansas, it doesn't work. And you can't scare people in Florida into having an income tax by yelling Kansas. And it's not some magic word. But what the real goal of the other team was here was to take out the part of the bill that the governor put through, which I thought was the heart of it. Okay, not so much the tax cuts as when revenues go up to this point, the corporate and income tax and individual income tax come down permanently to this level. It was a spending cap enforced by cutting tax rates permanently when you hit certain numbers. Now, it was the one thing the other team wanted to take away. Okay, they didn't want to fix the problem by closing loopholes. They didn't want to fix the problem by letting you sell beer on Sunday. They wanted to take down, it's like when Saudi Arabia fights with Kuwait, Qatar, and they say they're terrorists, and their one requirement is that they get rid of Al Jazeera, the TV show that broadcasts into Saudi Arabia and discussed Saudi Arabia's internal politics. So, there are these 10 bad things, and what do you want to do? Want them to turn that TV show off. I think they were about the TV show. And when the left said we're mad about what's happening in Kansas, and the thing we have to stop is the spending limitation / ratchet down overtime to zero. Okay, with normal growth within 25 years or so, that Kansas would have had no income tax, individual or corporate, and that would have made it very difficult for the left to put all their friends on the payroll. They have failed because we have the counter model in North Carolina, where they have put ratchets up each year and brought down, and they've hit every one of the targets, and then they've taken the income tax, personal and individual. It keeps coming down in North Carolina. It is not going back up again, and they can put those out. They may do this, another series of them, so that even with the Democratic governor, who they have enough votes to override his veto, they will keep this ratchet going down. I like the idea of having it one bill and permanent. They took that away from Kansas, but the idea of a ratchet down on the income tax is one that Arizona and Wisconsin and North Carolina are all looking at, with North Carolina having had several whacks at the apple. So I think if you had to, what were they really mad about was that model succeeding, because they don't like the 9 states that don't have income taxes, but they don't go to pieces over the subject. This was the model for any state, including California, including Illinois, to have set themselves on a path, longer path for them, down to get rid of the income tax. And I think we can come back to it, but the other team will yell Kansas, and we'll just have to yell louder North Carolina.
So speaking of spending, I thought the chart you showed, Dave, the long-term spending, each and every year, general fund spending has increased. And now we're 1 year out from the largest tax increase in Kansas, both in absolute terms and as a percentage of revenue, the largest tax increase in history. So on the ground, has the clamor for increased spending diminished? Have the legislators that capitulated, have they made new friends? What's it like on the ground in Topeka?
Well, last year, that's a great question, Joel. Last year, when they were debating how and when they were going to implement the largest tax increase in Kansas history, that last bar you saw on that graph was the new spending. We started internally calling it the Here Hold My Beer legislative session because there was one after another competing spending proposal. So they actually increased spending, one more, there it is, from last year. Well, it's in effect this year, about $350 million. Over the weekend, they approved a $525 million increase for school spending. And they're going to phase that in over 5 years. But now the game is, let's pretend we can do that without a tax increase. So it's the clamor for more revenue in Kansas will never end, because spending money is how politicians get elected.
Thanks, Dave. I'd like to get some closing words to legislators from each of you, and then we'll have about 5 to 10 minutes of time for questions from the audience, starting with you, Jonathan.
Great. Well, I think as Dave put it, the idea is to be more like North Carolina model and less like, of course, what we learned out of the Kansas model. But the North Carolina model and the model of 29 other states that have significantly cut taxes over the last 5 years has been a model of success, a model of providing for core government services by reducing also at the same time the cost of doing business in a state. That's the whole idea of our Rich States, Poor States project over the last 11 years now, is to show those states with the lowest tax burdens, and the states, of course, with the lowest tax burdens on income being some of the best performing states out there across the country. And I think, looking at this, for every Kansas they have, we have 30 states that are following the tax cut works model and keeping government limited and growing the private sector economy. And just, final observations on spending so much time here. I mean, reading so many of the headlines as Tim was reading earlier, you would think Kansas doesn't have running water or paved roads anymore based on what has gone on with this tax plan. But when you look at those numbers right right there on general fund spending, when spending has continued to grow each and every year, you quickly realize that spending and taxes have to match. It's two sides of the same fiscal coin at the state level. We don't have the luxury up here at Washington, D.C. of just quantitatively easing more resources into a budget situation. States have to live within their means and balance their budgets every single year, and that's a good thing for taxpayers. But it reminds me, in conclusion, of my favorite economist, Thomas Sowell. He hits it just so perfectly, and he says, the first law of economics, of course, is a scarcity of resources, while the first law of politics is to ignore the first law of economics. And that is where we got our problems in Kansas.
Thank you, Jonathan.
I would add for state legislators and for taxpayers that we need to focus on the Supreme Court and the states. Because one of the problems that Kansas had was they had a Supreme Court insisting that they spend more money and claiming the legal authority to do it. And the governor threatened to go after them in terms of a constitutional amendment and so on, but wasn't able to either term limit them or something else. We saw this in New Hampshire, where they used the word, the state shall cherish education. And they said, oh, well, do you know what they meant in 1774? What they meant was, and they gave a dollar figure on what cherish would be. So you can rewrite that song with a dollar sign on it. And that kind of nonsense that the courts come in and say, cherish means, $10,000 per student, or we say that you have to raise taxes to pay for more education because we find something in the Constitution that nobody had ever seen before. Legislators and governors need to spend time focusing on the kind of courts you have in these states, because some of our best governors and best state legislators have been thwarted by Supreme Court decisions. There was one in Florida, which has one of the lousy courts, and they said, two-thirds requirement to raise taxes, that violates the single subject rule, taxes plural. And within a year or two, they said, we're going to legalize gaming. And there were like 7 types of gambling. They said, well, it's gaming, one thing. So when you can play those kind of games, the legislature can become, the courts can become dictatorial. And that was a piece, I don't know whether you see it's a tenth of a piece or a quarter of a piece or what piece of the inability to rein in spending, but it was part of it. And once you allow them any leeway, there's nothing that stops them from asking for twice that.
Yeah, that was a significant piece.
Half, a quarter, a third, a tenth. Guesstimate?
It's half to a quarter at least, maybe more than that, because that's also the most powerful lobby in getting people elected. So, that played a significant role. I guess I would. Those are. I wish I'd thought of both of those. They're great comments. Messaging. The other side is really good at telling stories, and we're really lousy at it. Imagine if you were a governor going into a room and saying, does anyone in here think government operates efficiently? You'd have to wait for the laughter to die down. And then you follow that with something, that's how we're going to reduce your taxes. We're not going to cut spending, because when people say cut spending, they think cut services, because that's what government has conditioned them to think. No, I'm not going to cut the service. I'm going to cut the cost of the service. You have to lead with how we're going to do it. Make the opposition say, no, we want to waste money on providing those services. You have to learn how to change the narrative. There was it's kind of like, and it was an old Edmund Burke quote that said, and I'll paraphrase it for modern days, the worst thing that can happen to a good idea is to be, that was Bastiat. Worst thing that can happen to a good idea is not to be successfully attacked, but to be poorly defended. And we really didn't defend this. We didn't go out. There was bad messaging. So understanding what you're trying to accomplish and bring people along with you.
Thank you, gentlemen. And we do have some time for some questions from the audience. And Peter, well, just wait for the mic. There.
Let me suggest a long-term project here, given the comments that were made about the courts ordering tax increases. You can change the law, so courts should not have the power to order tax increases. That should be something that's reserved to the legislature. And so we need to have a long-term project. take away their power to order tax increases. And that's a long-term fundamental reform, and that needs to be a long-term project.
The interesting thing in Kansas is that the problem we have is not with the Supreme Court, it's with this Supreme Court. There was a court ruling in the early 90s that said the court did not have the authority to set spending levels and therefore set tax policy, that's an inherently political decision. It's this group of Supreme Court judges that think they now can do it. They've declared, yes, we do have this right. Of course, they say we're not really telling you how to spend money, but they are. And so there is an attempt going on to change the Constitution in Kansas to really take back. It's not to change it as much as it's to reaffirm that is the legislature's sole prerogative. You have to be really careful and think now, how will courts 20, 30, 100 years from now interpret this to do what they want to do?
Well, there's also some real discussion I remember in years past, and we've gone through several iterations of court funding challenges and battles with the legislature. And every time, even though there's some saber rattling on the legislative side, they get to that close to the imposed deadline where schools would potentially close, and the legislature blinks, and they don't want to follow through on the threat of dividing or defending divided government in terms of separation of powers in three branches of government. But Dave, it might be instructive if you just take a moment and talk about how Kansas goes about selecting its Supreme Court judges versus the model in so many other states.
We call it the worst model possible in the country. There is a 9-member commission that recommends a panel of 3 names. And 5 of those 9 members are from the State Bar Association. So the State Bar basically says, here, Governor, here are 3 names for you to choose. It's not subject to Senate confirmation. It's what the bar wants. That needs to change.
So I noticed in your presentation, your number one takeaway was that you can't cut taxes and increase spending. This question goes to Mr. Norquist with a more federal focus. Is this just setting up the left to call the Trump tax cuts a failure because 3 months after they were passed, Congress increased spending by 14%?
Yeah, I don't know that they'll be successful, but they will shift from, are you creating growth and jobs, and is the wealth of the country growing faster than debt? They'll shift it to, we passed the tax bill, which if the economy grows at 0.4% a year more than it was planning to for a decade, there's no debt deficit increase. It pays for itself with modest growth. We're already about 3% now. But they'll say, we passed the tax bill, and the deficit jumped because they went and increased defense spending dramatically, and in order to buy the D votes for that, we increased a lot of other spending dramatically. Yes, that will be a challenge, and Reagan had to live with that. I mean, Reagan cut taxes, spent more money on defense, and the left insisted on a whole bunch of other spending, and that increased deficit and spending was blamed on the tax cut.
We have time for one more question, if there is one. Seeing none, I want to remind everybody we do have complimentary copies of Dave Trabert's book on the outside table, so please take one. And there's lunch outside, so thank you everyone for being here, and thank you to our panelists.
Thank you.